On December 8th, a camera caught a sinister moment on a Manhattan sidewalk. John Lennon was signing an autograph for a timid 25-year-old fan. 6 hours later, that exact same fan fired 5 bullets into John Lennon's back, stopping time across the globe. History books say a mentally unstable drifter acted alone. But what if the established narrative is a crafted, government-mandated lie? What if the fan in the photograph was merely an actor taking the fall for a politically motivated hit? And what if the assassin who actually pulled the trigger was a young, rising horror novelist named Stephen King? This isn't just some Reddit theory. It's a decades-long crusade and one of the most bizarre conspiracy theories ever. It's a war waged by a single man who has plastered his gospel across the sides of a terrifyingly decorated Chevy van. Today we are tracking down and decoding the darkest delusion in rock history. In the mid-90s, the streets of coastal California were regularly haunted by a very strange sight. It was a two-toned mid-70s Chevy van with its exterior transformed into a rolling, angry manifesto. Emblazoned across the metal side panels in massive letters were the words, "Stephen King shot John Lennon." Just beneath this accusation was a secondary challenge daring the public to engage him. Evidence proves or you win the van. And who wouldn't want that van? The window of the vehicle was completely obscured, taped over from the inside with a conspiracy wall composed of documents, typed accusations, highlighted newspaper clippings, and grainy blown-up photographs. This mobile headquarters belonged to Steve Lightfoot, a man whose entire existence seemed tethered to uncovering a plot that nobody else could see. His crusade landed himself on the public radar in 1994 during a book reading given by Stephen King at the University of California's Santa Cruz. Lightfoot believed that the Santa Cruz City Council, alongside President Richard Nixon and major news magazines, were actively working to suppress the truth. And as proof of the local government's complicity in this cover-up, Lightfoot pointed to the hundreds of falsely issued parking tickets he routinely found on the windshield of his van. Rather than acknowledging that parking an oversized, strange, decaled van illegally on busy college streets causes you to get tickets, Lightfoot believed the traffic enforcement was a targeted psychological operation designed to silence him. The harassment eventually forced a legal response from Stephen King, and he issued a cease and desist letter to Lightfoot. And of course, this only poured gasoline on the conspiracy theorist's paranoia. Rather than retreating, Lightfoot interpreted this legal threat as validation, confirming in his mind that he was dangerously close to exposing a grand, world-shifting cover-up. These public disruptions would span decades and cross state lines. On the evening of February 20th, 2009, Lightfoot appeared in Florida. He walked into the meeting of the Sarasota City Commission. Lightfoot approached the microphone carrying a sign promoting his digital manifesto, LennonMurderTruth.com, and launched into a diatribe accusing Stephen King of assassinating the former Beatle. He was in Florida because Stephen King owned a winter home on Casey Key. Lightfoot stared down the baffled city officials and warned them, "Stephen King is scaring away all the celebrity cachet you could have," before the council ordered a guard to promptly eject him from the chamber. Lightfoot was very dedicated to the cause. He handed out self-published pamphlets on beach boardwalks, made frequent calls to local radio shows, and executed public disruptions that blurred the line between being a nuisance and obsessive stalking. But what exactly was behind his madness? The core of Stephen Lightfoot's theory is a geopolitical motive rooted in the anti-war movements of the 1970s. According to the lore that he has meticulously crafted on his website, Presidents Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan had grown angry about John Lennon's political activism after the federal government's failed attempts to deport the former Beatle. Lightfoot claims that Nixon and Reagan formed a shadow government pact. Their solution was to orchestrate an assassination on American soil. But rather than using the CIA, the FBI, or even the military, Lightfoot thinks that they decided to hire a horror novelist from Maine who was just beginning to achieve mainstream Hollywood fame with adaptations like The Shining. Lightfoot's primary visual anchor is the iconic Frame 19 taken by Paul Goresh outside of the Dakota. By severely exaggerating the facial features of Mark David Chapman in 1980 and ignoring anatomical differences like bone structure, height, and build, Lightfoot insists that the man receiving the autograph is actually Stephen King in disguise. According to his theory, Mark David Chapman was an actor hired by the government to serve as a willing fall guy, providing the celebrity author with total cover to commit the murder and slip away unnoticed into the New York night. To explain how Nixon and Reagan communicated their assassination orders to a writer, Lightfoot claims that the government embedded cryptographic codes in the bold print headlines of Time, Newsweek, and the U.S. News and World Report in the issues printed before, during, and after the night of December 8, 1980. He claims that these secret headline messages contain the killer's true identity, the killer's face, and direct references to Nixon's 1980 book, The Real War. Lightfoot believes that the the highest levels of the United States government were orchestrating a domestic assassination by hiding instructions in plain sight across the public layout of mainstream mass-marketed newspapers and magazines, relying on Stephen King to decode them while buying groceries. For over 30 years, Lightfoot pored over every book, interview, and comment made by Stephen King. He claims that the author's writings draw from the crime, viewing King's entire bibliography as a series of arrogant, thinly veiled confessions. Lightfoot believes King intentionally taunts the public through his writing, hiding his guilt in plain sight while laughing at a world too blind to decipher the clues buried in novels like Misery and It. The entire framework looks exactly like the Charlie GIF. Despite driving a literal advertisement for his theory for decades, Lightfoot's brand of paranoia was so strange that it failed to spawn any sort of a wider movement. The theory relies on Chapman being a hired actor wearing a mask to protect a famous author. But the real Mark David Chapman was a man leaving a heavily documented trail of psychiatric collapse that the conspiracy completely ignores. The reality of John Lennon's murder is tragic, rooted in severe, untreated mental illness. Mark David Chapman was a 25-year-old former security guard whose life was spiraling. He was raised in Dakota, Georgia, and he had once been a devoted Beatles fan, but a shift in his religious beliefs caused him to turn violently against his former idol. He became obsessed and enraged by John Lennon's 1966 remark that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, and was further upset with lyrics to songs like God and Imagine, which he viewed as hypocritical given Lennon's vast wealth. Chapman's psychiatric history has been heavily documented. In 1977, he dropped out of Covenant College and was facing a crumbling personal life wrapped in guilt over a failed relationship. He flew to Hawaii and attempted to self-unalive. The attempt would fail, and Chapman would later incorporate this into his grand delusions. He would be subsequently admitted to the Castle Memorial's Hospital psychiatric ward for clinical depression. By late 1980, Chapman's identity had fused with Holden Caulfield, the main character of J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. He identified with Caulfield's hatred of phonies and desired to emulate the character so completely that he planned to cite the novel as his manifesto. Chapman suffered from intense parasocial attachment and cognitive dissonance, attempting to resolve his chronic feelings of insignificance by destroying a massive cultural figure, thereby absorbing his fame and cementing his own identity. Chapman's movements on December 8, 1980 are established, leaving no room for a celebrity body double to operate. Following the shooting, Chapman made no attempt to flee. He simply removed his coat to show he was no longer armed, stood on the sidewalk, and began reading his copy of The Catcher in the Rye while waiting for the police to arrive. When Dakota security guard Jose Perdomo approached him sobbing, asking, "Do you know what you did?" Chapman remained calm. During a psychiatric evaluation before his trial, the defense team and the prosecution clashed over his competency. Before the trial could proceed to a jury verdict, Chapman informed his legal team that he had received a direct message from God instructing him to plead guilty. The judge deemed him competent to make this decision and accepted the plea, sentencing him to 20 years to life at the Wend Correctional Facility. He remains there today, having been denied parole over a dozen consecutive times. Since Chapman's guilt is a matter of ironclad historical record, well, where does that leave Stephen King? In Steve Lightfoot's narrative, Stephen King was a covert government assassin operating under the neon lights of Manhattan in late 1980. But the reality of King's life during this period paints a very different picture. In 1975, Stephen King and his family moved from Boulder, Colorado back to Bridgeton, Maine. In mid-December 1977, the Kings would purchase a property in Center Level, Maine. Center Level was a summer resort town that was largely deserted for 9 months out of the year. In the fall of 1978, Stephen King accepted a position to teach creative writing at his alma mater at the University of Maine in Arona. Tired of the transient lifestyle, the Kings decided to lay permanent roots. In 1980, the Kings officially purchased a towering Victorian mansion in Bangor, Maine. And it was during this period, as he was settling into his home, that King was formulating the deep social history of Derry, the fictional Maine town that would serve as the setting for It. King spent his time walking the streets of Bangor, drawing inspiration from local landmarks like the massive Thomas Hill standpipe and the looming Paul Bunyan statue in the downtown district. On December 8, 1980, Stephen King was a 33-year-old father in Bangor, Maine, working as a novelist and enjoying a quiet life far removed from the celebrity frenzy of Manhattan. When he would be confronted by Lightfoot, King reportedly responded with a mix of humor. At a public reading, when a conspiracy screamer stood up to accuse him of killing John Lennon, King paused for a beat and quipped to the audience, "Well, then there's the other side," generating a huge ovation as the man was escorted to the exit. The fact's clearly off, but what happened to the man who held the camera? The story of the photograph that launched Steve Lightfoot's crusade is heartbreaking. Paul Goresh was a 21-year-old amateur photographer from New Jersey. He was a lifelong devoted Beatles fan who had set up a permanent encampment on the sidewalk outside of the Dakota between August and December 1980, just hoping for a glimpse of his idol. Goresh had actually entered the Dakota in February 1979, knocking on Lennon's apartment door. Instead of calling the police or reacting with any sort of entitlement, Lennon answered the door and joked, "I thought it was the cops." Over the next year, an unlikely friendship blossomed between John Lennon and the sidewalk superfan. The two had an ongoing inside joke regarding an autographed copy of Lennon's 1965 book, A Spaniard in the Works, which was forever going between the front desk and the apartment, never quite making it to Goresh's hands. On the afternoon of December 8th, Goresh struck up a conversation with Mark David Chapman, completely unaware of the .38 special concealed in the man's pocket. According to later interviews, Chapman had actually intended to shoot Lennon that afternoon when the singer was exiting the building but chickened out, only to return later that night. When Lennon exited the building at 4:40 p.m., he told the photographer he would see him the next day to review some photos, and finally confirmed that he had signed the long-awaited copy of A Spaniard in the Works. As Lennon paused to sign Chapman's album, Goresh raised his camera. The resulting image, frame 19, shows Chapman in profile staring intently at the album while Lennon signs it. When the news of the assassination broke hours later, Goresh was overcome with a sickening realization. He immediately contacted the police to report that he had photographic evidence of the killer. But the police had already arrested Chapman at the scene and secured the murder weapon. So they initially threatened to arrest Goresh for wasting their time. The New York Daily News would eventually purchase and develop the film, printing the image that would shock the world. But frame 19, the image that Steve Lightfoot would aggressively plaster across his van and website, was not the final photograph taken of John Lennon. Goresh took 3 more photos as Lennon walked away and entered the limousine. In the final image of the roll, the flash of the camera failed to deploy. The result is a dark, poorly exposed, almost ghost-like silhouette of Lennon stepping into the vehicle. Because of the low quality, it was rarely published by the media, leaving frame 19 to become the last known photograph, forever linking the victim and the killer in the public consciousness. The photograph was a source of heavy psychological burden for Goresh. "You can't imagine the disgust and anger I felt," Goresh would say in an interview decades later. He had captured the exact moment the timeline fractured, inadvertently supplying the raw material for decades of morbid fascination and conspiratorial madness. Goresh captured the truth, but the truth was too painful for some to bear. How does the human mind warp a photograph of a tragedy into a decades-long delusion? The assassination of John Lennon traumatized the global cultural psyche, as demonstrated by the immediate reaction of his peers. The senselessness of the act was impossible to process. Paul McCartney would say, "Drag, isn't it?" He later had to publicly defend it as an inability to articulate his profound grief. Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards allegedly grabbed a firearm of his own and scoured the streets of Fifth Avenue searching for the killer in a blind rage. When reality is this chaotic and devastating, the human brain seeks order. A lone gunman driven by voices in his head, feelings of inadequacy, and the pages of a paperback novel is a random explanation for the death of a godlike cultural figure. A massive government conspiracy orchestrated by 2 presidents and executed by a famous author, while completely absurd to you or me, implies that the universe is under control. It suggests that there's a script, even if that script is evil. Steve Lightfoot's van is a rolling monument to this psychological defense mechanism. He spent 30 years reading non-existent codes in Newsweek and screaming at the Sarasota City Commission because the alternative, the idea that a mentally ill man named Mark David Chapman simply walked up and fired a gun, was too senseless to bear. The tragedy of December 8th, 1980 needed no embellishment. The truth is already documented, and in the face of such senseless loss, some men will drive to the ends of the earth just to pretend that it all made sense.